my talk today is primarily the 50s. I could take it back a little bit earlier than the 50s, and the relationship between the Arab progressive movements, the Arab nationalists, specifically the Ba'ath Party, and the Nasserism in that period vis-a-vis the West, and what has eventually evolved and what we are experiencing today. So primarily, really, the concept of Arab nationalism and the fight for independence, you could trace the modern Arab nationalism concept. You could trace it back to the turn of the 20th century. The Arabs were largely under colonial domination of the Turks, the Ottoman Turks, and that was the time when the Ottoman, the young Turks movement started in Turkey to get rid of the decadent Ottoman Sultanate. At the same time, the Arabs were waking up, and to their misfortune, the Arabs did trust the West to help them get their independence from the Ottoman Turks. And they trusted them so much that they thought their only salvation is going with alliance with the West. And unfortunately, that did not materialize. In fact, the Arabs, until today, do feel they were betrayed by the West, first in the 1970s, when the Balfour Declaration was issued, promising Palestine to European Jews. That was the first betrayal that the Arabs felt the Europeans had brought upon to them. And then their support of, or supposed support of, independence from Turkey, and to their shock and surprise, in fact, the British, and we're talking of the West at the period, it was really the Europeans, and primarily the British and the French. And the British and the French were in secret dividing the Arab lands among themselves. So some part of the Arab world was to be taken. They didn't call it colonial, they call it mandate in some areas under a British mandate, some were under a French mandate. On top of that, the Arab Maghreb, which is North Africa, Morocco, Tunisia, and Algeria, were already under a French occupation. They were literally a colonial parts of France. During that period, the most active proponent of Arab nationalism were really Arab Christians, Arab Christian thinkers, ideologists, poetry, books were promoting the concept of Arab unity and Arab nationalism. And with what was happening in Palestine and the conflict at the time, and we're talking, this is before the creation of Israel, and with the dividing of the Arab lands, the concept of Arab nationalism and unity and fight against colonial powers became intensified, to the extent that in the mid-40s, the Ba'ath Party was born. And the Ba'ath Party is really the most significant party that evolved in the Arab world. And unfortunately, in 2-3 decades later, it went sideways. But it was the aspiration of the Arabs was through the birth of the Ba'ath Party, which preached Arab unity, Arab nationalism, and Arab independence and socialism. The socialism part was primarily borrowed from the West, Marxism, the birth of the Soviet Union, of course, 30 years earlier. So that was socialism, the socialist component of the Arab idea, of the Ba'ath ideology. The Ba'ath Party was born in Syria and Lebanon. At the same time, there were intellectuals, both Muslims and Christians. Some were professors at the American University of Beirut. So there was quite a bit of European influence, European ideologies influence in the birth of the Ba'ath Party. And as I said, it was and still, in fact, the biggest movement as a party in the Arab world. Soon after that, in 1952, the Egyptian monarchy, and it was an Egyptian monarchy. It was, by the way, it wasn't an Arab monarchy. The king was, by descent, was Albanian, appointed, well, his ancestors were appointed by the Turks. So the Egyptian monarchy was toppled. The birth of Egypt as a republic under President Jamal Abdel Nasser. And that's where the concept of Nasserism came in the picture. Nasser, like the Ba'ath, preached for Arab unity, preached for independence. He did espouse socialist policies throughout his regime. However, he was less of an ideology. His socialism was based on his deep roots in Islam, which is a religion of equality. And from the very miserable economic situation of the ordinary Egyptian, there was quite a gap between the wealth of the landlords, and a lot of them were in fact Turks by origin, and the majority of the Egyptian peasants. So Nasser became extremely popular because he was in power. The Ba'ath were not in power, but they were popular among the masses. And these two groupings or two ideologies at times cooperated with each other, and at times they had a conflict with each other. But both of them preached the same thing. Again, as I said, Arab unity, Arab nationalism, and socialism. The Americans, the West, to start with, obviously were against Nasser's revolution in Egypt. The Americans tried to court Nasser. They did sell Egypt some weapons, sometimes in secret. But they really wanted, what they were after, they wanted a military alliance between the United States and Egypt, with the aim of Egypt being the first Arab country to enter into a peace agreement with Israel. That Nasser did reject on both grounds. He rejected going into a peace agreement with Israel, and rejected to enter into an alliance with the West or with the United States. And he campaigned along with world figures at the time, Tito and Nero, neutralism, and he wanted to be neutral between the both superpowers, the Soviet Union and the United States. And he continued that policy until the day he died. But it is what was then and what is continues until today, and what the Arabs strongly feel. American and Western policies, American and European policies towards the Arab world, primarily focused, to look at it from the Israeli side. What's good for Israel is that what the Americans thought or preached that is good for the Arabs. Everything else about preaching human rights and independence and all that proved to be not true, because the Americans and the West primarily supported dictatorships in the Arab world, which by definition and by practice against fulfilling other Arab aspirations. And although nominally the Arab countries became independent, they were and still are under the influence of the West. And to this day, in spite of the riches, in spite of 200 million people of the Arab world, really the Arabs are insignificant players on world stage, whether economically, politically, or in any other respect, culturally. So the 50s really were a very active period in the sense here we started with the Ba'ath Party agitating for power, particularly on the eastern side of the Arab world, that is Lebanon, Syria, Iraq. And then we have at the same time followed by Nasser's revolution, and Nasser was extremely, extremely popular in the Arab world, throughout the Arab world. And his popularity really stems not from any policy he preached in Egypt or any policy that he implemented in Egypt. His popularity is because he preached for Arab unity and Arab independence. And those were the two ideas that the Arabs most cherished. And they were always looking for unity. Anyone who had spoken of unity was immediately popular and accepted by the Arab masses in the 1950s. However, Arab unity and a united Arab republic, as the Arabs were aspiring to, was definitely not what the West wanted, because the West did not want a strong Arab world. And again, the West policies were always a reflection of what they perceived as good for Israel, and it should be the policy. So Nasser wanted to modernize, and I'll go back. The Arabs themselves are very individualistic people. Therefore, the Arabs would not be, or would not accept, and did not accept communism at that time, because communism was definitely not something the Arab tribal character of independence and individualism they would want. And really, the Arabs never went or loved communism or the Soviet Union at the time. Having said that, when Nasser wanted to modernize his army and wanted to acquire modern weapons, the Americans prevented him from doing that. So in turn, he turned to the Soviet bloc, and he bought. The Russians didn't want to openly sell him weapons. He turned to Czechoslovakia, the former Czechoslovakia, and bought weapons from Czechoslovakia. That was the first event. Then, 2 years later, Nasser thought of, obviously he wanted to develop Egypt. The Nile water was giving Egypt abundance of water, the Nile River, sorry. But at the same time, it flooded very often, it destroyed farms and cities, and most of the water was going to waste in the sea. So Nasser wanted to build what they call now the High Dam. It's a huge project to control the flow of water of the Nile and distribute it in Egypt. He negotiated with the World Bank and the IMF and thought that he was going to get the financing to build that huge project, but the Americans stood on the way. And because of their influence and their control over the World Bank and the IMF, the High Dam was never financed. So here comes Nasser, in spite of his heritage of being an Arab and a Muslim, and they don't go along with communism as such, he went hat in hand to the Soviets. And the Soviets were more than willing to come forward. They gave him the financing, and they gave him the expertise to build the High Dam. This way, in fact, Egypt was lost to the West for the next 2 decades at least, and created the animosity and among the Arabs, or the mistrust among the Arabs of the West, particularly by then led by the United States. To top it all, Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal, which was owned and operated by the French and the British.